Welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The impossible crime. It was in the early weeks of April, during that strange interlude between the fading chill of winter and the first true breath of spring, that the case began, a case so curious and laden with contradictions that even Holmes, seasoned in the grotesque and improbable, was momentarily stilled upon hearing the particulars. I remember the morning well. The fog had rolled in off the Thames with unusual vigor, casting Baker Street in a thick, pale shroud. It clung to the windows and muffled the sound of distant hoofbeats, making the world feel unnervingly silent. Holmes was at the breakfast table, engrossed, not in eggs or toast, but in the Times, which he perused with his usual keenness. I had just returned from a brisk walk, and was warming my hands by the fire, when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, a lady, Celestine Blackbriar. The name meant nothing to me at the time, but it evidently did to Holmes, who looked up sharply and folded his paper with a snap. "Lady Blackbriar," he said. "Show her in at once, Mrs. Hudson, and bring tea." Moments later, the woman entered our sitting room in a rustle of dark velvet. She was tall, statuesque, and pale in the way of one long untroubled by sun or common hardship. Her eyes, however, betrayed a disquieter, flickering unrest that suggested sleepless nights and more questions than answers. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice soft but brittle, "thank you for receiving me without notice. You arrive unannounced." "Milady," which often signals either extreme urgency or supreme arrogance. "I suspect, in your case, it is the former." She inclined her head, perhaps unsure whether she had been insulted or flattered. "The situation is impossible, Mr. Holmes," she said, "and yet it has occurred. My brother is dead, killed in a locked room, alone, without a mark upon him, and surrounded by," she faltered slightly, "by roses." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Roses, not vases of them. They were ... growing through the walls, through the floorboards, thorns in the curtains, petals on the ceiling, a veritable jungle of them, blooming violently overnight, and now he lies at the center of it, untouched, uncut, and very much dead." I must admit that at this, I even shifted forward in my seat. Holmes' eyes glittered. "And where did this miracle of botany occur?" he asked. "At our ancestral home, Dunlock Abbey, in Surrey. It is an old place, as you may know. Cold stone, long shadows, a cursed past, suitable for novels, but inconvenient for the living. My brother, Lord Edmund Blackbriar, was the last of his line, and the room was locked from the inside. Yes, bolted, windows shuttered and sealed, no hidden panels that we could detect, no secret passageways. I do not exaggerate when I say that it is an impossibility. You have brought the police into the matter." Inspector Harrington from the local constabulary, a stout man, well-meaning but entirely baffled. "He believes it must be poison, though no vial was found, no trace left in the body. A physician examined Edmund, no bruising, no punctures, no abrasions. It is as though he simply lay down among the roses ... and expired." Holmes rose and paced to the window, where the fog still loomed like a quiet threat. He remained silent for a time. "Did your brother have enemies?" he asked finally. "Not enemies, precisely," she said, "but he had secrets. Edmund was always ... peculiar. After our parents died, he withdrew into books, botany, and the occult. He spoke often of blood in the roots and the thorns that remember. I took it for madness or poetic affectation." Holmes turned abruptly. "And these roses, have you kept them intact?" "They began to wither almost immediately after dawn, as though their life had ended with his. Some remain, blackened and dry. I had the room sealed." "Watson," Holmes said, reaching for his coat, "cancel any engagement you might have today. It appears we are bound for Dunlock Abbey." "But what do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. "Roses growing overnight in a sealed room. It defies all logic." "That is precisely why it interests me," Holmes replied, his tone sharp with anticipation. Nature does not operate in the irrational. If a curtain has grown thorns, it is not the curtain that lies. Something else is festering beneath the surface, and I intend to unearth it. Lady Blackbriar rose, clutching her gloves with trembling fingers. Then you believe there is a rational explanation? I believe, Holmes said, that the more impossible a crime appears, the more mundane its mechanism tends to be once properly illuminated. Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was in the early weeks of April, during that strange interlude between the fading chill of winter and the first true breath of spring, that the case began, a case so curious and laden with contradictions that even Holmes, seasoned in the grotesque and improbable, was momentarily stilled upon hearing the particulars. I remember the morning well. The fog had rolled in off the Thames with unusual vigor, casting Baker Street in a thick, pale shroud. It clung to the windows and muffled the sound of distant hoofbeats, making the world feel unnervingly silent. Holmes was at the breakfast table, engrossed, not in eggs or toast, but in the Times, which he perused with his usual keenness. I had just returned from a brisk walk, and was warming my hands by the fire, when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, a lady, Celestine Blackbriar. The name meant nothing to me at the time, but it evidently did to Holmes, who looked up sharply and folded his paper with a snap. Lady Blackbriar, he said. Show her in at once, Mrs. Hudson, and bring tea. Moments later, the woman entered our sitting room, in a rustle of dark velvet. She was tall, statuesque, and pale in the way of one long untroubled by sun or common hardship. Her eyes, however, betrayed a disquieter, flickering unrest that suggested sleepless nights and more questions than answers. Mr. Holmes, she said, her voice soft but brittle. Thank you for receiving me without notice. You arrive unannounced. Milady, which often signals either extreme urgency or supreme arrogance. I suspect, in your case, it is the former. She inclined her head, perhaps unsure whether she had been insulted or flattered. The situation is impossible, Mr. Holmes, she said, and yet it has occurred. My brother is dead, killed in a locked room, alone, without a mark upon him, and surrounded by, she faltered slightly, by roses. Holmes steepled his fingers. Roses, not vases of them. They were, growing through the walls, through the floorboards, thorns in the curtains, petals on the ceiling, a veritable jungle of them, blooming violently overnight, and now he lies at the center of it, untouched, uncut, and very much dead. I must admit that at this, I even shifted forward in my seat. Holmes' eyes glittered. And where did this miracle of botany occur? He asked. At our ancestral home, Dunlock Abbey, in Surrey. It is an old place, as you may know. Cold stone, long shadows, a cursed past, suitable for novels, but inconvenient for the living. My brother, Lord Edmund Blackbriar, was the last of his line, and the room was locked from the inside. Yes, bolted, windows shuttered and sealed, no hidden panels that we could detect, no secret passageways. I do not exaggerate when I say that it is an impossibility. You have brought the police into the matter. Inspector Harrington from the local constabulary, a stout man, well-meaning but entirely baffled. He believes it must be poison, though no vial was found, no trace left in the body. A physician examined Edmund, no bruising, no punctures, no abrasions. It is as though he simply lay down among the roses, and expired. Holmes rose and paced to the window, where the fog still loomed like a quiet threat. He remained silent for a time. Did your brother have enemies? He asked finally. Not enemies, precisely, she said, but he had secrets. Edmund was always ... peculiar. After our parents died, he withdrew into books, botany, and the occult. He spoke often of blood in the roots and the thorns that remember. I took it for madness, or poetic affectation. Holmes turned abruptly. And these roses, have you kept them intact? They began to wither almost immediately after dawn, as though their life had ended with his. Some remain, blackened and dry. I had the room sealed. Watson, Holmes said, reaching for his coat. Cancel any engagement you might have today. It appears we are bound for Dunlock Abbey. But what do you make of it, Holmes? I asked. Roses growing overnight in a sealed room. It defies all logic. That is precisely why it interests me, Holmes replied, his tone sharp with anticipation. Nature does not operate in the irrational. If a curtain has grown thorns, it is not the curtain that lies. Something else is festering beneath the surface, and I intend to unearth it. Lady Blackbriar rose, clutching her gloves with trembling fingers. Then you believe there is a rational explanation? I believe, Holmes said that the more impossible a crime appears, the more mundane its mechanism tends to be once properly illuminated. We set off before noon, the mist thickening as we departed, wrapping itself around our hansom like a living shroud. In the distance, I fancied I could already smell roses, not the pleasant, delicate fragrance of a summer bloom, but something deeper, stranger, heavy, cloying. And so began one of the most bewildering cases Holmes and I had ever encountered. The case of the curtain that grew thorns. Chapter 2. First whispers at Baker Street. By the time we returned to Baker Street, after accompanying Lady Blackbriar to her waiting carriage, the fog had thickened to such a degree that even the lamplighter had become a spectral silhouette in the gloom. The gaslight outside our rooms cast no warmth, only an eerie orange glow upon the cobblestones. Holmes lit his pipe with more relish than usual and settled into the armchair beside the fire, his long fingers steepled before him in contemplative stillness. Meanwhile, occupied myself with sharpening a pencil and opening my notebook, more out of habit than necessity, while I said at last, "What do you make of it, Holmes? Growing roses, a locked room, a man dead without a wound. Surely even you must find it fantastical." Holmes exhaled a long stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Fantastic, yes, but not beyond reason. No case that presents as impossible ever is. It is the apparent absurdity that makes it appealing." I leaned forward. "Do you suspect this Lady Black? Her bearing is aristocratic, but her emotions seem genuine." Holmes glanced at me with faint amusement. "You surprised me, Watson. Your usual sentiment would have her weeping into a handkerchief and fainting at the door, which she did not do. And yet, her composure is not evidence of guilt. Aristocrats are often trained from birth to mask emotion." He tapped the bowl of his pipe against the rim of the fireplace. "No, what intrigues me is the language she used. Thorns in the curtains, petals on the ceiling, and her brother's ravings, blood in the roots. The thorns that remember." Such poetic phrasing is not accidental. Either it is the reflection of a disturbed mind or a deliberate performance designed to heighten the theatricality of the crime. "You think she might be exaggerating?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "that someone wants this death to appear unnatural. And in my experience, when one attempts to disguise a natural act such as murder beneath the cloak of the supernatural, it is because the motive is entirely human." I considered this in silence, then ventured, "Could it have been some rare toxin? Something from the plants themselves? Perhaps the roses were cultivated to deliver a fatal dose of." Holmes held up a finger. "No need for conjecture, Watson. That is the habit of Lestrade. We shall examine the scene and determine whether science or superstition reigns at Dunlock Abbey. Until then, we operate only upon the facts at hand." "And what facts do we possess?" I asked, trying not to sound as skeptical as I felt. Holmes turned his gaze toward the ceiling, as if reviewing a mental ledger. 1. A man is found dead in a locked room. That alone is worth noting. 2. The room, previously ordinary, is suddenly overwhelmed by Rose's living ones, it seems. 3. There is no visible wound or sign of trauma. 4. The roses begin to wither almost immediately after the body is discovered. 5. The victim had a history of isolation, occult interest, and according to his sister a penchant for cryptic phrases about thorns and blood. He paused. "It is too early to determine the significance of these details, but they form a pattern. We must gather the rest of the tapestry." I watched him with a familiar sense of awe. Though I had witnessed it many times before, Holmes' ability to distill a torrent of information into manageable deductions never failed to impress me. "And what of this Inspector Harrington?" I asked. "Do you know him?" "Only by reputation. Honest, dependable, and utterly conventional. I dare say he has already declared the matter a case of poisoning, and is searching Dunlock Abbey for rare roots and mushrooms." "Perhaps he is right," I said mildly. Holmes allowed himself a wry smile. "And perhaps the roses sang a lullaby to Lord Blackbriar as they strangled him in his sleep." We lapsed into silence for a few minutes. Outside, the fog thickened further, pressing against the window panes like the breath of some invisible beast. The fire crackled in the grate, and for a moment it felt as though the very atmosphere had absorbed the strangeness of the case. Then Holmes rose suddenly and crossed to the bookshelf. Drawing down a slim leather-bound volume, the language Lady Blackbriar used, he muttered, flipping through the pages. "It struck a chord. Yes, ... Here." He held up the book for me to see. It was an obscure collection of English folk tales, rare ones, many originating from the lesser-travelled parts of Surrey and Kent. "The Thornwood Curse." Holmes read aloud. A local legend about a man who defiled sacred ground and was found days later, strangled by roses that had grown from his bed. Fascinating. Most likely apocryphal. But if Edmund Blackbriar had an interest in the occult, he may have attempted to recreate such a tale, or someone else may have done it for him. You mean as a form of murder by, I asked. Precisely. To cloak an act of violence beneath folklore is to invoke fear and paralyze inquiry. The villagers will whisper of curses while the real murderer walks free. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a folded telegram on a silver tray. Holmes opened it, read quickly, and nodded. It is from Inspector Harrington. He confirms our arrival is expected tomorrow at 10 o'clock. The local authorities have made no progress. Lady Blackbriar has arranged for us to stay at Dunlock Abbey until the matter is resolved. I groaned inwardly. Another sleepless night in a draughty mansion, haunted by whispers and creaking floorboards. Holmes smiled thinly. Come now, Watson, you must admit it is rather more invigorating than typhoid cases and London fog. I could not argue. Even with the shadow of death clinging to it, there was something undeniably magnetic about the case. The strangeness of it, the theatricality, the sheer impossibility, it all promised that peculiar thrill I had come to associate with the man seated across from me. Holmes looked out the window once more, then turned back with a gleam in his eye. Pack warm clothes and sturdy boots, he said. We are bound for Thorns, Watson. Chapter 3. A scene of deception. Dunlock Abbey was everything one might expect from a family estate soaked in history and steeped in superstition. As our hired carriage creaked its way up the long gravel drive, I beheld a vast Gothic structure rising from the mist like some petrified beast. Its grey stone walls were streaked with damp, and ivy clung to the crumbling arches like aged scars. A tower half ruined jutted against the slate sky, and the windows, those that weren't shuttered, reflected only the pale light of morning. Like unblinking eyes, Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. There, he said softly, pointing to the eastern wing. Do you see the uppermost window? The one with the warped glass? That, I imagine, is our locked room. How can you tell? I asked because the ivy is torn where someone forced entry or exit through a narrow slit just above. That tells me someone has already attempted to investigate from the outside, or perhaps someone wished to escape notice. Before I could press him further, the carriage rolled to a stop. We were met by a stiff, barrel-chested man with ruddy cheeks and thick, greying eyebrows. Inspector Harrington, no doubt. Mr. Holmes, he said, offering a brisk nod. And Dr. Watson. You're welcome, though I warn you, you won't find much to work with. It's a damned riddle, and I've half a mind to blame it on old Blackbriar madness. Let us reserve madness for last, Inspector Holmes said with a faint smile. Lead us to the scene. Lady Celestine Blackbriar awaited us in the grand entryway, draped once more in dark velvet. She gave us a silent nod and led us through a series of cold, echoing halls until we reached a narrow spiral staircase that led to the eastern wing. The room remains untouched, she said. Only Inspector Harrington has entered, and he disturbed as little as possible. Holmes offered a curt nod of approval. The door to Lord Edmund's chamber was a heavy oak thing, bolted on the inside and showing no sign of forced entry. Harrington produced the key and unlocked it, revealing a room that might have belonged to a monk. Plain stone walls, high ceilings, a desk cluttered with books, and a narrow bed by the shuttered window. And the roses, they were everywhere. Though their brilliance had dulled and browned, their presence was unmistakable. Thorned vines curled through the wooden slats of the shutters, having forced their way through the tiniest of cracks. Petals lay in wilted clusters across the floor. A thick bundle of stems had burst through the fireplace, grating like some coiled serpent. And strangest of all, the curtain near the Bedan old brocade affair was torn from top to bottom, the edges stiff with dried sap, as if actual thorns had grown from the very fabric. Holmes said nothing for several long minutes. He moved slowly through the room, gloved fingers trailing near, but never quite touching anything. He crouched by the curtain, studied the desk, examined the fire grate with intense scrutiny. Then he stood over the body of Lord Edmund Blackbriar. The corpse was pale, lips slightly parted, as though surprised in his final moment. There was no blood, no signs of struggle. He lay atop the bedsheet, fully dressed in a linen shirt and dark trousers, hands folded as though in repose. Holmes gestured for me. Observe, Watson. Note the fingertips. I bent down and peered. There's dirt beneath the nails. Indeed, "And what do you make of that? That he had been in the garden recently, or that he struggled to remove something before he died? Both possibilities. Yet I wonder why is there soil under the nails of a man who reportedly locked himself in for the night? And why is the soil flecked with black ash?" Holmes turned to Harrington. "Has the fireplace been used recently?" "No, sir. It's cold as stone. The maid said Lord Edmund hadn't lit it in weeks." Holmes crouched by the grate again and, producing his magnifying glass, studied the vines that had grown through it. "Curious," he murmured, "extremely curious." He stood and walked to the desk. Upon it lay a journal, its cover cracked and brittle with age. He flipped through a few pages. Latin phrases, botanical drawings, notations that grew more erratic as they neared the end. "Rosa obscura," Holmes read aloud. "Sanguis is Hagesibu's blood from the roots. And here she sleeps in thorns, and I with her." A reference, perhaps, to some imagined lover or muse, or something more ominous. Lady Celestine stood silently by the doorway, her face unreadable. "Your brother, did he ever mention anyone named Livia?" Holmes asked suddenly. Her eyes flickered, just slightly. "Livia, I know. Not in my hearing." Holmes did not press her, but I noted the slight narrowing of his eyes. He returned to the curtain, now half hung and stiff with dried thorns. "Would you say this curtain is original to the room?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "It's been there for decades. I believe it belonged to our grandfather." "Then how," Holmes said softly, "has a species of vine native to South America embedded itself within its fabric?" No one answered. Holmes made a final slow circuit of the room, pausing once to test the latch on the shuttered window, which held firm. Then he straightened, brushing dust from his knees. "Well," he said at last, "we have witnessed the scene. A man, locked in a room, surrounded by roses that should not be here, exhibiting no cause of death save for circumstance, a curtain that has grown thorns, and a corpse with dirty fingernails and ash beneath the soil." He turned to the inspector. "I take it, Harrington, there are no footprints outside the window, no evidence of climbing?" "None," the man said flatly. "Then the question is not how someone got in," Holmes mused, "but how something got out." And with that enigmatic remark, he strode from the room, leaving us to follow through the echoing corridors of Dunlock Abbey while the thorn-strewn chamber behind us seemed to grow colder. Still. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects by early afternoon. The air inside Dunlock Abbey had taken on the stillness of a mausoleum. It was not merely the hush of ancient stone or the damp quiet of a countryside manor. It was a hush that pressed inward, carrying the weight of something unspoken. Even the very servants moved with a certain unease, glancing behind them as though the house itself had grown eyes. Holmes, having concluded his preliminary inspection of Lord Edmund's chamber, requested that all those present in the house on the night of the death be assembled in the eastern drawing-room. "There is something to be learned," he said, "not just in what people say, but in how they wait to say it." The drawing-room was a wide, high-ceilinged space, lined with books and faded portraits. The fireplace was unlit, and the smell of old paper clung to the drapes. Holmes positioned himself by the hearth, arms folded, while I stood a pace behind, notebook in hand. Inspector Harrington stood to one side, stiff, clearly skeptical but silent. One by one, they arrived. The first was Mr. Julian Armitage, a distant cousin of the Blackbriars, and according to Lady Celestine the only remaining male relative. He was a man of 35, well-dressed, with pale hands and a nervous habit of smoothing his mustache. His eyes darted frequently to Holmes, then away again, as though unsure how to look at a man reputed to see through souls. Following him was Miss Beatrice Langley, Edmund's personal secretary. She was a slight, pinched woman in her late 20s, with ink-stained fingers and an expression caught halfway between fear and fatigue. She kept her eyes on her boots as she entered, and muttered a brief greeting before retreating into the far corner. Next came Mr. Oswald Grange, the groundskeeper thickset, with weather-beaten features and boots that tracked in flecks of earth. He glanced around the room with mild suspicion, then folded his arms and leaned against the wall as though daring someone to question him. Then there was Mrs. Flora Greaves, the long-time housekeeper, a widow with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. She moved like a clockwork figure, precise and careful. Her mouth was thin, her posture erect, but there was a flicker in her eyes. I could not interpret grief or wariness, perhaps both. Lastly came Father Ambrose, the village priest, a gaunt man in his 60s with sharp features and a gaze that never quite rested anywhere for long. He carried with him a faint scent of candle wax and incense, and his hands were stained with ink and tobacco. Lady Celestine remained nearby, watching all with the impassivity of a paint statue. Holmes surveyed them for a moment in silence before speaking. "I thank you all for coming. I will not waste your time with unnecessary formalities. You are aware that Lord Edmund Blackbriar is dead under circumstances which, at first glance, defy reason. I believe reason is very much alive. Here it merely hides under layers of performance." A few of them shifted uncomfortably. "I have some questions, and I encourage care. I am not here as a policeman, nor will I pass judgment, but I will find the truth." He turned first to Mr. Armitage. "You are a cousin of the deceased?" "Yes, sir. Third cousin on the maternal line. Edmund and I were not particularly close, but I visited once a month. Family obligation, you understand. Were you here the night of his death?" "I was. I'd arrived that morning. I was staying in the West Wing, nowhere near Edmund's chambers." Holmes nodded. "And your relationship with Lady Celestine?" Armitage hesitated. "We are cordial. She manages the estate's finances. I stay out of such matters." Holmes made no comment. He turned to Miss Langley. "You were Lord Edmund's secretary. What sort of work did you undertake for him?" She looked up at last, her voice soft and brittle. "Transcription mostly. Notes from his journals. Letters to botanists. Cataloguing seeds and specimens. He was very particular about order." "Was he in good spirits recently?" "No," she said. "He'd grown. Strange. He was obsessed with the roses. Spoke to them sometimes. Said they remembered things, that they would protect him." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Protect him from what?" She shook her head. "He never said, but he was afraid. Not of anyone here, but of something older. Something in the roots." A murmur stirred the room. Holmes turned next to Mr. Grange. "You are the groundskeeper." "Aye," he said. 15 years. Did Lord Edmund have a private garden?" Grange grunted. "He did. Behind the abbey, fenced off. Nobody but him had a key. Grew strange plants there. Nasty things with barbs and creeping vines. Said they needed peace. Said they spoke to each other." "Did he ever harvest them?" "Not that I saw. Just watched them. Sometimes at night." Holmes glanced at me, as if filing something away. He moved on to Mrs. Greaves. "You managed the staff?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes." "Did Lord Edmund ever dismiss servants unexpectedly?" "No, but many left of their own accord. They didn't like the East Wing. Said it was ... listening. They said they heard whispers, when no one was there." Holmes was silent for a moment, then turned at last to Father Ambrose. "You knew the family long?" "Since before Celestine was born. I baptized them both." "Had Lord Edmund consulted you recently?" "Yes, a week before his death. He asked me about sacrilege." Holmes' brow rose. "What sort of sacrilege?" The priest looked uncomfortable. "He said he'd violated something beneath the soil, that he had unearthed a thing best left buried. I advised him to rest. He did not take it well." Holmes folded his arms. "Interesting." He allowed the silence to settle again, letting the weight of the room build. "Thank you all. For now, you may go." They filed out slowly, none speaking, though all stole glances at one another. As the door shut behind the last of them, I turned to Holmes. "Well, a collection of liars, the lot of them," he murmured. "Some lie by omission, others by nature. But one thing is certain, someone in that room knows exactly what killed Lord Edmund Blackbriar." Chapter 5. First Suspects. The red herring. The morning after our initial interviews, I awoke in a room that seemed to breathe with the abbey itself, draughty, shadowed, and far too still. Holmes had risen long before me, and when I descended to the east drawing-room, I found him hunched over a small table littered with plant clippings, ashes, and a thin trail of soil that he did not look up as I entered. "Watson," he murmured, "what do you make of this?" I bent closer. Before him were 3 distinct samples, each laid carefully on white handkerchiefs. One appeared to be a shriveled black stem with thorns so fine they could scarcely be seen. Another was a brittle cluster of rose petals, now almost entirely grey. The third, and most curious, was a strand of fabric lightly, from the brocade curtain, pierced cleanly through by a thorn. "They appear mundane enough," I said cautiously, "but I presume you found them in Lord Edmund's chamber." "Indeed. But note this." He nudged the fabric toward me. "The thorn here did not pierce from without, but grew through the weft of the curtain itself. No root, no external vine. It is as though it manifested inside the cloth." "Which is impossible," I said. which is precisely why it interests me." Before I could question further, the door swung open, and Inspector Harrington entered, his brow furrowed and mustache damp from the morning mist. "Holmes," he said, holding up a folded sheet of paper. "New development. One of the maids found this slipped under her door early this morning. Anonymous, of course." Holmes took it with a nod, unfolded it, and read silently. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. "Well?" I asked. "It suggests," Holmes said slowly, "that Miss Langley, the secretary, is not who she pretends to be." He passed me the note. The handwriting was a rough scrawl. "The woman with ink on her hands lies with every breath. She visited the rose garden at night. She spoke to the thorns. She knows." "Could this be a hoax?" I asked. "Some attempt to mislead us?" "Almost certainly," Holmes said, "but hoaxes have a tendency to reveal more than they conceal. And liars, Watson, are most dangerous when someone else believes they are telling the truth." We found Miss Langley in the library, hunched over a pile of account books. When Holmes entered, she startled visibly. "Miss Langley," he said gently, "I wonder if you might accompany us for a brief word in private." She hesitated, then nodded. We led her to a narrow study just off the library, where Holmes shut the door behind us with a quiet click. "There has been an accusation," he said, "and I must ask you plainly, did you enter Lord Edmund's garden during the night in the week preceding his death?" Her lips parted, then closed again. I could see her throat work as she swallowed. "Yes," she said finally, "I did." Holmes did not react. For what purpose? I was curious. He had become increasingly erratic, obsessed with the plants. I thought, if I understood what he was doing out there, I might be able to calm him. "Did he know you were there?" "No." I was careful. "And what did you observe?" She hesitated. "There were shapes, strange, unnatural growths. He'd cultivated a breed of rose I'd never seen before, dark as ink, with thorns like needles. He would sit for hours among them. Sometimes he spoke to them. Once, I heard him say," she listens still, "Did you ever touch the plants?" "No, I didn't dare." Holmes studied her a moment longer. "Miss Langley, are you aware of a local legend called the Thornwood curse?" She paled. "He mentioned it, said the roots knew what we had forgotten." I thought it was nonsense. Holmes turned to me, his tone brisk. "Watson, do take a walk with the inspector to the garden. See if the gate lock shows signs of tampering. Also look for footprints that may not belong to Lord Edmund." "Footprints, after a week of rain and mist?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "That which should have vanished may still remain, if no one expected us to look." As I left with Harrington, I glanced back once. Miss Langley had sat down, her head in her hands. Holmes, still motionless, watched her not with suspicion, but with something closer to pity. The rose garden was situated at the rear of the abbey, concealed by a crumbling wall and a tall iron gate wrapped in dormant ivy. Harrington jangled a ring of keys before selecting the correct one. The gate creaked open with a reluctant groan. The garden, though no longer flourishing, retained a strange, haunted beauty. Beds of black-stemmed roses stood half-withered, as if recoiling from our presence. Vines curled around shattered trellises, and the soil was unnaturally dark, almost black in places. I moved carefully, eyes scanning for any anomaly. Harrington moved toward a broken bench near the center, grunting. "Looks like someone sat here recently." I knelt, brushing aside a layer of dead leaves. Beneath, I found a faint impression, narrow boots, small, a woman's. "Perhaps someone besides Lord Edmund was here," I said. "But who?" We returned to the abbey just as Holmes was emerging from the study. He accepted the news without comment, but I noted how his fingers tapped once against his thigh, rare sign of inner momentum. "I have what I need for now," he said. "We must let our suspects stew in the broth of their own secrets. The scent will rise soon enough." "And Miss Langley?" I asked. "You believe she's innocent?" "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that she is frightened, but not of us. And whoever wrote that note wants her removed from suspicion before she says too much." He turned back, toward the corridor. "Come, Watson. The curtain may be growing thorns, but it is not the only thing hiding a barbed truth." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. That afternoon, a brooding silence settled over Thornwood Abbey. The staff moved with subdued purpose, whispering in hallways, pausing at every creak in the wooden floors. Though no one dared speak it aloud, the air was thick with suspicion. A death might be declared natural by the law, but not by the human heart, certainly not when the dead man's garden still seemed to breathe and twist with secrets. Holmes remained in his chamber for several hours, poring over his notes and the samples he'd retrieved. I busied myself in the library, scanning local histories, hoping for some insight into the so-called Thorned curse. What I found, however, was something else entirely. "Holmes," I said, when I finally joined him in the drawing room just after dusk, "I've discovered an inconsistency, rather a small one, but curious." He looked up from the botanical chart he had been sketching. "Proceed." "In the guest register, I found mention of a certain Professor Godfrey Wood, who supposedly visited Thornwood Abbey 3 months ago to advise Lord Edmund on rare botanical cultivar. Miss Langley referenced him in one of her logs. Yet I cannot find any correspondence from this Wilmot in the household files. Not a single letter or reply." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And you suspect the professor never existed?" "Either that, or he was not who he claimed to be." Holmes stood, brushing specks of dried soil from his sleeve. "Watson, you astonish me. I had reached the same conclusion regarding that name last night, but your deduction confirms it. There is no Wilmot at Cambridge, Oxford, or any Continental Botanical Society. I wrote to several last week after reviewing the logs." "Then who was he?" "That," Holmes said, "is what we must now determine." We descended into the old cellar shortly after supper. Holmes had received word from Mrs. Penler, the housekeeper, that some of Lord Edmund's private items had been stored down there after his death. She had refused to enter the space herself, citing an ill smell and strange movement in the shadows. We brought lanterns. The light flickered against stone walls, casting long, jerking shadows over barrels, old portraits, and forgotten trunks. The air was thick and damp, tinged with mildew and something else. "Smell that?" I asked. "Rotting vegetation." Holmes nodded, moving ahead. "Something organic has been stored here recently." He found the trunk in question tucked behind a barrel of cracked sherry bottles. It bore Edmund's initials but had been hastily shut with a rusted latch. Holmes pried it open. Inside, among the expected clutter-torn notebooks, seed packets, and sketchbooks, we discovered something startling. A journal. Its cover was bound in worn green leather, the pages thick and ink-smudged. Holmes flipped to the center and read aloud. "August 14th. She responded again today." The blood coaxed the bloom further. I heard it whisper beneath the soil. "She sees through the petals now." I shuddered. He was mad. Holmes didn't answer immediately. "Not necessarily. Delusional, perhaps, but madness implies fabrication. What if he truly saw something?" He turned to another entry. "August 27th. Godfrey warned me. Said I was digging into memory itself, but he fears what I welcome. These roses were not meant for beauty. They remember the soil they came from. They know." "Godfrey again," I said. "So he existed but was using a false name. Or it was an alias Edmund invented to mask another advisor, someone who didn't want to be known." Holmes paused, then suddenly rifled through the rest of the trunk. He pulled out a bundle of letters tied with crimson thread, odd, as the others were bound with twine or string. These were different. The envelopes bore no postage. All were signed only with the letter M. "Curious," Holmes muttered. "M. No surname, no seal." He opened one and read silently, his expression tightening. "Well," I asked. "They are instructions, detailed ones. How to distill a compound from the rose's sap. Directions to treat the roots with a particular solution to awaken the buried code." I echoed. Possibly metaphorical, possibly not. I felt a chill creep down my spine. But these letters, how did they arrive, if there's no postage? They must have been someone local. We both froze at the thought. Someone from within the abbey or the nearby village had been guiding Lord Edmund's bizarre experiments in secret, possibly still watching. Back in the warmth of the parlor, Holmes sat in thought, the journal open across his lap. I poured us both tea, though he ignored his cup. "There is one thing we must do now, Watson," he said quietly. "We must find the identity of M, and to do that, we'll need to consult someone who saw more than they understood." "The staff." "Better," Holmes said. "The younger servants, someone whose innocence may have been their best disguise." He rose, suddenly animated. "Fetch me young Thomas, the stable boy. He delivers the post and sometimes runs errands to the village. If someone was sneaking letters past the household, he may have noticed more than he knows." I found Thomas in the stables, brushing down one of the mares, a wiry lad of about 14, with freckles and ears that stuck out like shutters. He looked frightened when I asked him to come speak with Mr. Holmes, but he obeyed. Inside, Holmes greeted him gently. motioning for him to sit. "Thomas," he said kindly, "have you ever seen anyone visiting Lord Edmund late in the evening? Perhaps someone delivering letters or packages, someone who didn't use the front door?" Thomas fidgeted. "Maybe. I did see someone once, just before harvest time. Black coat, hat pulled low, came round the west side near the rose garden. Didn't use the bell." "Did Edmund meet him?" "No, sir. I think he left something in the garden, just dropped it into the flower bed and walked off. Quick as anything." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you remember anything else about him?" Thomas nodded. "He limped, sir, not badly, but one leg dragged." Holmes sat back, satisfied. "Thank you, Thomas. You've helped more than you know." As the boy departed, Holmes murmured, "Now we search for a limping man, possibly local, who signs with M and trades in unnatural knowledge. The roots of this case, Watson, are deep indeed." Chapter 7. The Visitor in the Fog. A shadow returns that night. The mist returned, thicker and colder than before. It rolled in over the hills like a living thing, coiling through the hedgerows and pressing against the windows of Thornwood Abbey with silent insistence. Even the hearths seemed to burn more dimly, as though the fog were reaching inward, dampening flame and thought alike. Holmes stood at the drawing-room window, arms folded, watching the haze deepen. "This is the second night the fog has come down so suddenly," I remarked, setting aside my cup. "Unseasonal for this time of year." "Yes," he murmured, "and curiously punctual." He turned from the window, thoughtful. "Fog, Watson, is not always nature's whim. Sometimes it is a curtain drawn when something must move unseen." The house had settled into its nightly hush. Most of the guests had retired early, and the remaining staff were tucked into the servants' quarters. Outside, the rose garden, eerily beautiful in the moonlight, seemed to beckon. Holmes moved with sudden purpose. "Come, Watson, we're going out." I looked up, startled. "Into the garden?" He gave a small smile. "Exactly. I have a suspicion, and tonight the fog may be our ally." We donned our coats and stepped into the night, lantern in hand. The moment we crossed the threshold, the fog swallowed us whole. Visibility shrank to mere feet. Even the familiar path to the garden felt foreign. The roses loomed like sentries in the dark, tall, twisted, some blooming crimson, others pale as bone. The scent was stronger now, cloying, unnatural. Holmes paused at the western edge of the garden, near the bed Thomas had described. "There," he whispered. Disturbed soil, fresh. He knelt and brushed aside the damp earth. His fingers uncovered a small oilskin-wrapped parcel buried beneath a rosebush. Within it, another letter sealed with no mark, addressed to no one. Holmes opened it with care. "The time nears. You've seen the signals. She is almost ready. Do not delay further. Once the curtain lifts, we begin." He exhaled slowly. "They're still communicating, Watson. Even after Edmund's death." A twig snapped behind us. We turned instantly. Holmes with his cane lifted, I with my lantern held high. The fog shifted. A figure stood at the garden's edge, cloaked, hat brim low, one leg slightly bent inward. He did not flee. Holmes stepped forward, voice low but firm. "Stop where you are." The figure did not speak. Instead, he turned slowly, deliberately, and limped back into the mist. We pursued at once, crashing through the hedges, down the path toward the orchard beyond the garden wall. The fog thickened, blinding us. I could hear the stranger's uneven steps just ahead. Then dash, nothing. Gone. We stood in the orchard, panting. The trees loomed like ghosts, and the fog seemed to mock us. "He was real," I said. "You saw the limp?" Holmes nodded. "And he wanted to be seen, at least enough to confirm he still watches. This is no longer merely a question of plants or experiments, Watson. We are dealing with something ritualistic, occult." I asked, "Perhaps, but I suspect a scientific mind has cloaked his work in spiritual trappings to hide its more profane applications." We made our way back to the house in silence. Later that evening, Holmes spread the new letter beside the others from the mysterious M. He studied the handwriting, his brow furrowed. "Note the curvature of the R, the downward hook of the S. This is the same hand that wrote all of them. So the visitor is M, or someone acting on his behalf. The style is urgent, commanding, not the tone of a servant. Whoever M is, he believes he controls events here." A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Penler entered, her face pale. "Pardon me, sirs, but Lady Helena requests your presence in the east parlour. Something distressing has occurred." We followed her quickly. Helena stood near the hearth, her hands clasped tightly. On the table before her lay an envelope. "I found this in my jewelry box," she said. "I hadn't opened it in months. I don't know how it got there." Holmes picked it up. No postage, no seal, only the same slanted handwriting. She must not resist. The cycle demands it. Her blood will complete the bloom. Helena turned away, shivering. "What does it mean? Who's it about?" Holmes's eyes darkened. "Perhaps you." She turned sharply. "You are the last living Langley tied by blood to Edmund, and this garden, this experiment seems rooted in your family line. But Edmund was only a cousin." "By blood," Holmes interrupted softly. "Enough, perhaps, for someone to believe your connection carries weight." I stepped forward. "Lady Helena, has anyone ever told you of a family legend, a myth about the roses, anything strange in the history of the garden?" She hesitated, then nodded. "My grandmother used to speak of the red veil. She said the women in our line would sometimes hear voices when the roses bloomed brightest. She said it was a gift, but that it came with a price." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Watson," he murmured, "we are not merely in the garden of a botanist's obsession. We are walking among cultivated myths groomed over generations into something far more dangerous." He turned to Helena. "You must be watched closely. No one enters the garden alone. And if this M believes you are the final key, he may soon make his move." Helena sank slowly into a chair. "But why? Why would someone do this?" Holmes didn't answer at once. He picked up the note again, his voice quiet. "Because, Lady Helena, someone believes your blood will make something ancient bloom again." Chapter 8. The Langley Ledger, Secrets of the Past. The following morning arrived grim and grey. The fog had receded somewhat, but a heaviness clung to the air, as if the house itself had absorbed the dread of the previous night. Holmes rose early and summoned me to the breakfast room before the rest of the household stirred. "I have requested access to the family archives," he said, buttering a slice of toast with surgical precision. "If our adversary clings to the idea of bloodlines and cycles, then the key may lie not in modern letters, but in the records of the past." "Do you believe the Langleys have harbored this practice for generations?" I asked. "Not necessarily." He took a bite. "But someone does. Whether it began as myth, madness, or misinterpretation of scientific law, it has rooted itself in this family and in this soil. We must uncover the seed." Helena met us in the library shortly thereafter, visibly exhausted but resolute. "The archives are behind the study," she said. "They've not been organized in years, I'm afraid. You'll find ledgers, journals, correspondence, anything the Langleys thought worthy of keeping." We followed her into a narrow hallway, at the end of which stood an iron-bound door. She produced a brass key from around her neck. "This hasn't been opened in over a decade," she murmured. With a turn of the key, the door creaked open, revealing a chamber of forgotten history. Dust hung thick in the air, and the scent of paper and mildew filled our nostrils. Shelves lined the walls, some bowed with the weight of ancient tomes, others littered with loose documents. Holmes immediately took to the far wall, his gaze scanning labels and bindings like a hawk. "Watson, here," he called after several minutes. I crossed to where he stood, peering over his shoulder. He held a thick volume labeled Langley Household Ledger 1803-1830. Holmes set it on a table and opened it carefully. The entries were handwritten in an elegant but meticulous script. It appeared to be a record of house operations, notable visitors, finances and, intriguingly, botanical experiments. Summer of 1811 rosebed expansion, successful. Lady Margaret reported disturbances in dreams once more. Experiment number 14 continues. Holmes read aloud. Bleeding rose reverted to pale on equinox. I frowned. Bleeding rose. He flipped back several pages. Yes, here again. Experiment number 9, crossbred from Eastern hybrid and native red. Responds to moonlight, water salinity, and blood. We stared at one another. Holmes closed the ledger slowly. This is no delusion of Edmund's alone. These so-called experiments have persisted for over a century. We continued our search, uncovering several more volumes, most of them dense with lists of Latin plant names, symbols, even strange diagrams of roots resembling human nerves. Then Holmes unearthed a small, leather-bound journal, unmarked but well-worn. He opened it and skimmed a few pages. This belonged to Lady Margaret Langley, Helena's great-grandmother. Listen to this. He comes in the mist, trailing roses in his wake. I cannot see his face, but I know his steps. The thorns part for him. I bleed and sleep, yet wake whole. The garden speaks. It wants me again. He paused. Delirium, or documentation, possibly both, I said. Either she was mad, or being manipulated. Holmes turned another page. More careful now. Mother forbade the ritual, but the gardener whispered of the old vow. Edmund listens. He says it's just science, but the garden knows better. It is not science, it is hunger. Good God, I whispered. Holmes nodded grimly. The gardener, perhaps the first of many in the line. Perhaps M is his descendant or the gardener himself, passed on only in title. Just then, Helena entered quietly, her expression uncertain. You've found something. Holmes gestured for her to sit. Lady Margaret kept a journal. In it, she describes experiments with roses that respond not only to traditional horticulture, but to something darker. Helena paled. She was institutionalized in her later years. My father said it was melancholia, but I remember hearing stories, children's warnings, never to walk among the roses at night. Holmes leaned forward. Did she ever speak of a figure in the mist? A man the garden obeyed. Helena's brow furrowed. Yes, I remember something she used to say when I was very little. When the thorn man calls, shut your eyes and seal your lips. I thought it was nonsense. Not nonsense, Holmes said. A memory passed as rhyme. He stood, suddenly galvanized. We must speak to the current gardener. Helena hesitated. Mr. He's worked here only 5 years. Reclusive, but harmless. Holmes was already moving. No one involved in the care of this garden can be assumed innocent. Not until we understand what they tend. We found Mr. Pilcher in the southern greenhouse, trimming vines with deliberate care. He was a tall man, quiet and pale, with a cleft in his chin and eyes like cloudy glass. Holmes stepped inside first. Mr. The gardener looked up but did not speak. I'm Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I'm investigating certain events at Thornwood, particularly regarding the rose garden and its unusual cultivars. Still, the man said nothing. Holmes continued. Are you familiar with the Langley rose experiments? A flicker passed across Pilcher's expression. He set down his shears. I tend the flowers, sir. That is all. But not all flowers are mere plants, are they? Holmes pressed. Some grow from older roots, roots that carry memory. Perhaps. Pilcher's lips parted, then closed again. Finally, he spoke softly. I only do what I was told. The garden, it tells you what it needs, if you listen. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Who told you? The gardener hesitated. There was a letter when I arrived. No name. Instructions on soil mixture. Blooming cycles. How to feed them, Helena gasped. Holmes stepped closer. Where is the letter now? Pilcher met his gaze. Burned, like the others. Chapter 9. Blood in the petals. The garden's hunger awakens. The light that filtered through Thornwood's upper windows was grey and inert, a sluggish thing that settled rather than shone. Holmes and I left the greenhouse in silence, Helena trailing behind, pale with unease. The air carried a faint, sweet rot, roses somewhere in early decay, a contrast to their impeccable appearance. It was burned, Holmes muttered. Always the letters, always the fire. The past, Watson, is being systematically erased, and yet it keeps bleeding through. Do you believe in I asked, that he merely followed anonymous instructions. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stopped at the edge of the corridor where it met a long window overlooking the rear gardens. He's part of the cycle. Holmes finally said, whether by design or ignorance, he plays his role. And now we must uncover who composes the script. Back in the drawing room, Holmes requested tea and silence. With Helena's permission, he laid out our collected evidence, the ledger entries, Margaret Langley's journal, and a small pile of dried rose petals Helena had kept as a child, now brittle and dark as dried blood. He arranged the items meticulously, eyes flicking between them as if translating some ancient dialect. Watson, look at this, he said, handing me Lady Margaret's journal once more. He pointed to a specific entry. The thorns bloom before the solstice. This year, they weep early. Father says it is because the ground remembers, but I think it is something else. The roses feed on fear now, not blood, not truly, something deeper. I frowned. What could she mean? Holmes tapped the line slowly. Psychological resonance, perhaps. The victims don't just bleed physically, they suffer emotionally, spiritually, each of them steeped in grief, instability, or isolation. He paced, growing more agitated. Mrs. Bletchley, Miss Cora, even Helena's father, and now Edmund, all frayed minds, vulnerable, and each is drawn to the garden with peculiar intensity. Are you suggesting the roses select their victims? Holmes stopped pacing. Not the roses, no, but someone who understands the mythology of these roses, someone perpetuating a cycle under the guise of tradition. A knock interrupted us. It was Mrs. Hughes, her brow furrowed, holding a folded sheet of paper. This was found under the scullery window, she said. Fresh this morning. No one saw who left it. Holmes took it delicately. The paper was crisp, unblemished, typed in clean block letters. The roots thirst anew. The equinox draws near. The curtain must be watered. The chosen will know where to stand. Holmes's jaw clenched. The curtain again. A metaphor, or something literal. Helena stood, slowly. There's a room in the east wing, locked for years. My father called it the curtain room, said it was my grandmother's sanctuary during her episodes. We followed her without hesitation, past echoing halls and dusty portraits. At the far end, behind an arched door warped by time, we arrived at a room veiled in a peculiar stillness. Helena retrieved a key from a wall, recess, rusted, ornate, and turned it with effort. The door groaned open. Inside, the room was dim, curtained on all sides with thick, velvet drapery. The air was laced with rose oil, though no flowers were visible. Candles, long melted, littered silver sconces. A table stood in the center, covered in parchment. Helena stepped in first, breath-catching. I haven't seen this room since I was a child. Holmes moved swiftly to the table. These drawings, he pointed, cross-sections of rose stems, accompanied by sigils. Old ones, druidic possibly, but mixed with something chemical. I lifted a parchment. It bore a familiar mark, a serpent eating its own tail, the same that had appeared in Lady Margaret's journal. Holmes's eyes narrowed. There, in the corner, a note. He read aloud, "Bleed the chosen by the curtain's edge. 3 drops. No more. The root shall know. If the heart is false, the thorns will close." My skin prickled. It's ritualistic. Yes, Holmes murmured, and specifically, which means it has rules, which means it can be broken. Helena turned slowly, her face pale. What do they want? Why roses? Why here? Holmes paused, considering. The garden is a stage, he said. Each generation leaves behind notes, and something ensures the play resumes. They maintain the illusion of necessity. The roots thirst. The curtain must be watered. ... It is madness wrapped in doctrine. At that moment, a sound broke the heavy silence. A cry, faint, distant. We rushed to the hallway, following the echo. It came again from the lower level, a soft whimper, cut off abruptly. We ran, down the staircase, into the cellars. The air was thick, the stone walls damp and cold. We reached a side corridor that branched off toward the gardener's quarters. There, slumped beside a pile of overturned flower pots, was Mr. Pilcher. Blood trickled from a fresh gash on his forehead. Helena gasped. "Is he?" "No," Holmes said, kneeling to examine him. "He's breathing, unconscious." Beside Pilcher, something glinted on the stone floor, a thin ceremonial blade. Its handle was carved with rose vines, and scrawled across the wall in red. "The garden does not forgive betrayal." Holmes stood, his face darkening. "We're running out of time, Watson. This is no longer about uncovering history. It's about stopping a sacrifice." Chapter 10. Beneath the Velvet Veil. A voice in the garden. We carried Pilcher to a nearby bench in the cellar corridor, laying him gently upon it. His eyelids flickered, but he remained unconscious. Holmes knelt beside him, examining the ceremonial blade once more with grim focus. The hilt, shaped like intertwined rose vines, appeared worn in the grip, as though it had passed through many hands. He was struck, not stabbed, Holmes muttered. This blade was never meant for him. Someone interrupted a ritual, or sought to silence him before he revealed too much. Helena hovered nearby, wringing her hands. But who would do this? And why leave him here? Why not dispose of him? "To send a message," Holmes said, gesturing to the wall where the chilling words still dripped. "The garden does not forgive betrayal. Pilcher's usefulness has expired, but he was still part of their play. This," he motioned to the wall, "is a warning to us. Miss Fairfax." I turned to Holmes. "You said someone is orchestrating this ritual based on belief. But belief alone doesn't produce bloodied walls and stolen memories." "No," Holmes agreed. "It takes knowledge, access, and conviction. And someone within this estate, perhaps even within the Fairfax lineages, ensuring that belief endures. We carried Pilcher upstairs and placed him under the supervision of Mrs. Hughes, who paled upon hearing what had happened but agreed to keep the household calm. Helena, though visibly shaken, was insistent on continuing the search. "There's a voice," she said softly, as we stepped back into the corridor. "In the garden. Not a literal one, but a presence. Since childhood, I've felt it, especially in that place by the eastern hedgerow where the roses bloom unnaturally tall. Margaret once called it the Whispering Bend." Holmes turned toward her, eyes sharp. "Then it is time we visit that place." The sun was dipping low by the time we reached the outer gardens. A mist had begun to rise off the soil, mingling with the scent of damp roses. The greenhouse loomed behind us like a silent sentinel. We followed a narrow path that veered away from the cultivated flower bed, toward a secluded portion of the estate flanked by ancient stone walls. There, just as Helena described, stood an unnaturally tall arch of climbing roses, the branches twisted overhead in a natural tunnel, their blooms dark crimson, bordering on black. Despite the time of year, they looked full and strangely alive, dew trembling on their velvet petals like sweat on skin. As we stepped beneath the boughs, the air changed. It grew colder, and with it came a strange hum, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the low tuning of a stringed instrument. Helena froze. "It's louder now," she whispered. "I used to think it was the wind through the leaves, but it isn't. It knows when someone walks here." Holmes moved slowly, examining the base of each thick stem. He traced the roots with gloved fingers, following their convergence beneath the earth toward a central patch where the ground appeared darker and disturbed. "Watson," he said, beckoning me, "help me clear this." We knelt and began scraping away the damp mulch and leaves. Within minutes, the tips of a wooden frame emerged, a small hatch, weathered and moss. Holmes pried it open with his cane, revealing a descending ladder, old but sturdy. Helena recoiled. "I never knew this existed." "Nor were you meant to," Holmes said grimly. "Whatever rituals your grandmother performed here, they were hidden not just in language, but in layers of the estate." We descended carefully. The passage below was narrow, lined with old brick, and overgrown with fine roots that clung to the walls like veins. The further down we went, the stronger the scent of rose oil grew, sickly, almost cloying. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a low chamber, no larger than a modest pantry. Shelves lined the walls, holding vials, parchments, and more ceremonial blades, each bearing unique etchings. In the center was a circular basin, its base stained dark from age. Holmes examined the walls, brushing aside layers of grime to reveal carvings, words in Old English, mingled with Latin. The same symbol of the serpent consuming itself was carved directly above the basin. Helena stared at it, visibly disturbed. "My grandmother wore that symbol around her neck. She said it reminded her that pain was a circle, always returning." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "It isn't just a ritual, it's an inheritance. Each generation must reawaken the garden's power. But to what end?" I stepped forward, pointing to a sheaf of papers on one of the shelves, a journal bound in rose-pink leather. Holmes flipped it open. The entries were brief, almost clinical. Spring, 1885. The child would not bleed. The thorns did not close. Summer, 1892. I was chosen. I did not resist. The roses flourished. Winter, 1903. The voices return. The garden demands balance. Edmund's birth complicates the line. Holmes closed the journal. So Edmund was involved. From the beginning, groomed, perhaps, to continue the rites. Helena shook her head. But he ran. He changed. He wanted nothing to do with Thornwood's legacy. "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but blood is a stubborn echo. And the garden remembers." A sudden creak above drew our attention. We looked up the passage, but no figure stood there, just the faint sway of the hatch door, as though it had been disturbed by an unseen hand. Holmes's face hardened. "Someone knows we've found this place." We ascended swiftly. The mist had thickened, and shadows lengthened across the garden path. Back inside the manor, a silence had settled. We returned to the drawing room to find Mrs. Hughes alone. Pilcher had vanished. She clutched her apron. "He was here one moment, then gone. I only stepped away for a moment." Helena turned pale. "He's going back, to the roses. He thinks they'll forgive him." Holmes's eyes flashed. "No, someone led him there, and we have until nightfall to stop what they intend." Chapter 11. The roots beneath secrets never die. Night had settled heavily upon Thornwood Hall. A cold wind whispered against the stained glass windows, rattling them in their leaden frames. Somewhere beyond the velvet drapes, the garden pulsed with silence, brooding and expectant. Holmes paced the drawing room, his arms folded tightly behind his back, while Helena sat still in the corner, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Mrs. Hughes brought in tea. None of us touched. "There's no time," Helena said at last. "Pilcher is fragile. He may not know what he's walking into, but whoever took him does." Holmes nodded. "They mean to complete something, or undo it. Either way, he is a piece to be played. And that garden," he paused, glancing toward the shuttered windows, "it is no longer a passive place." "We should have burned it," she murmured. "All of it. Long ago." "Not yet," Holmes said. "Not before we understand what precisely we're dealing with." A sudden thud echoed from above, then a faint, scraping noise. We all turned toward the ceiling. The sounds seemed to drift downward, as though something or someone was moving through the upper levels of the manor. "Watson," Holmes said crisply. "The attic." I grabbed my revolver, and together we mounted the grand staircase. The floorboards creaked under our steps as we ascended toward the topmost landing, the faint scent of dust and lavender oil growing stronger with each step. The attic door was ajar. Holmes pushed it open, revealing a large, dimly lit space cluttered with old trunks, oil paintings, and furniture draped in yellowing sheets. The moonlight spilled through a single round window, casting long, warped shadows across the floorboards. Then we saw him. Pilcher stood at the far end of the attic, facing an armoire with its mirror door cracked. He did not acknowledge our presence. His shirt was rumpled, his eyes glassy with stupor or trance. "Mr. Pilcher," I called. "You've been hurt. Come with us." He didn't move. Holmes stepped forward, slowly, as one might approach a wild animal. "Mr. Pilcher, listen carefully. You are not in control. Someone is guiding you, someone who means you harm." Pilcher turned toward the mirror. "I see them," he whispered. "They're in the roots, and they speak." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who speaks?" "Pilcher." A beat of silence, then a whisper. "She does." The mirror fogged, though the air was still. A coldness passed through the attic like the breath of a cellar door, creaking open deep underground. "She told me to return," Pilcher went on, voice thin as thread. "She said, the garden needs blood, or it won't stop remembering." "Who is she?" Holmes pressed, coming to stand beside him, but Pilcher's eyes rolled, and he collapsed, body going limp. I caught him just before he struck the ground. Holmes knelt beside us, examining the side of Pilcher's neck. "Another puncture," he muttered. "Same as before. Dosed again." The person controlling him is using precise intervals, microdoses, to induce suggestibility. I looked toward the mirror. In its cracked surface, I thought I saw a woman's silhouette, hair plaited in a style 2 decades out of date, her eyes wide and glassy. But when I blinked, the image was gone. We carried Pilcher back down and placed him in the sitting room, locking the doors behind us. Holmes didn't rest. Instead, he returned to the pink leather journal retrieved from the garden chamber and began flipping through the entries again with feverish intensity. "There's a page missing," he said finally. Helena looked up. "You're sure?" Holmes nodded. "Torn cleanly. It would have been the final page. Perhaps the conclusion of whatever ritual these notes describe were its undoing. And who would want to hide that?" I asked. Holmes turned his eyes toward the hearth, where the fire had long gone cold. "Someone who fears the ritual's failure more than its consequences." A heavy silence settled in the room. Then Holmes straightened. "We returned to the garden. Before midnight." "Why midnight?" Helena asked. "Because rituals rarely wait for convenience," Holmes said. "And the roses, those unnatural roses, have been cultivated by someone with intent. That intent will reach its crescendo tonight, and we must be present when it does." Chapter 12. The petals close at midnight. The garden was a different world by night. The pale moon cast long silver rays over the twisting hedgerows, and the roses, those deep crimson aberrations, seemed to glow with an inner pulse, as though drawing breath. Holmes walked ahead of us, his silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the overgrown paths. I followed with Helena, who clutched her coat tightly against the cold dot. Mrs. Hughes had remained behind to watch over Pilcher, still unconscious but murmuring occasionally in his sleep snatches of verse, repeated names, fragments of something deeper than madness. Holmes paused before the stone arch that led into the central garden. Its iron gate had rusted nearly shut, but someone recently had pried it open. Mud still clung to the hinges. "There," he said, pointing to fresh footprints in the damp earth. "Two sets, one small, light-footed, the other larger male, possibly Pilcher, but more likely our unknown gardener." The deeper we moved into the garden, the thicker the roses grew. They curled around statues, climbed over benches, and wove themselves into the trellis-like veins through flesh. A narrow path led us back to the central greenhouse glass panels, darkened by moss and dirt. Vines pressed tight against the inside as if straining to burst free. Holmes raised his hand. "Wait." From within came a flicker of movement, shadow pacing, a woman's shape, unmistakable in outline. We ducked low beneath the windowsill, listening. A voice drifted through the cracked pane. Female, low, smooth, tinged with something ancient and eerie. Root to root, petal to petal. The cycle must complete. Holmes signaled silently and pushed open the greenhouse door. It creaked on its hinges as we stepped inside. The interior was a jungle. Massive rose bushes arched over trellises and choked the corners. The glass ceiling let in the moonlight, casting the entire space in a cold luminescence. At the center stood a stone pedestal, once a bird bath perhaps, now filled with what looked disturbingly like ash and petals. And before it, facing away, stood the woman. Her hair was silver blonde, plaited tightly. Her white dress shimmered with dew, but when she turned, Helena gasped audibly. "Clarissa," she whispered. The woman smiled, a smile untouched by years. Her skin was smooth, too smooth. Her eyes, however, were dead. "I told you I'd return," she said softly. Holmes stepped forward. "You are not Clarissa Halberd." "No," she replied. "But she allowed me to wear her face. A small gift, after so much time." Helena backed away. What are you?" "A memory, a root, a curse, spoken in love and sealed in grief. I was born in the garden when Clarissa bled on the altar, and I've waited long enough." "Waited for what?" I asked, though my hand gripped the revolver in my coat. "To finish what was started. The garden must be fed again, or else it turns inward, devours the house, the family, the bloodline that planted me." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You manipulated Pilcher. He was a seed, nothing more. He followed the roots I laid long ago, and the murders." Holmes's voice was low and sharp. The woman tilted her head. "Not murders, sacrifices. You must understand the difference. They were chosen, one for guilt, one for betrayal, and the last, for memory." "Who is the last?" Helena asked, voice trembling. The woman's gaze landed on her. "You, dearest." The greenhouse-grown vines shifting. The roses turned toward us, as if drawn by her voice. Holmes moved swiftly, flinging a vial from his coat pocket onto the altar. It exploded in a flash of white smoke, sending up a choking plume. "Now, Watson," he barked. I grabbed Helena's arm, dragging her back through the doorway as Holmes followed. The woman screamed not in pain, but in fury. Her voice echoed through the night like wind, through crypts. The roses recoiled, hissing, as we stumbled from the greenhouse. We ran blindly, past the hedgerows, through a cloud of petals torn loose by the rising wind. Only when the manor doors slammed shut behind us did we stop. Gasping, Helena looked at Holmes, eyes wild. "What did you do?" "I disrupted the ritual," he said. "Temporarily, but it is not finished, and she is not gone." "Then how do we stop her?" I asked. Holmes turned to the staircase. "We burn the roots. But first we find the true seed." Chapter 13. Beneath the rose altar the morning sun broke through the mist like a reluctant promise, casting long shafts of gold across the battered remains of Halberd Manor. A hush had settled over the estate as if the house itself were holding its breath. The events of the previous night had shaken us all, though none more than Helena, who now sat curled in an armchair by the library hearth, her expression vacant. Holmes stood by the tall windows, gazing out over the lawn where the roses still sprawled like red veins across the earth. He tapped a finger against his chin in silent thought. "She isn't truly a ghost," he said at last, "nor wholly a woman. What we saw last night was a construct memory given form, anchored by blood, ritual, and a very specific location." "The greenhouse," I said. "And that altar." Holmes nodded. "A conduit, but it's more than that. That altar was not simply decorative. It was the foundation. There's something buried beneath. It's something old. Something Clarissa, and perhaps even the original Halberds, knew to fear." Helena's voice emerged in a whisper. "Clarissa used to speak of what grows beneath. A thought at poetry, a turn of phrase. But now," Holmes turned from the window. It was literal. Within the hour, Holmes had summoned the estate's gardener, an aging man named Ellis, who had worked the grounds long before the current family moved in. With reluctant hands and wary glances, he guided us back to the greenhouse, this time by daylight. The interior had changed. The plants seemed subdued, the air heavier, damp with an almost fungal humidity. The stone altar stood as we had left it, but the ash within had hardened, as if scorched into place. "I remember this used to be something else entirely," Ellis muttered, squinting, "before the roses took over, long time ago. This was a mausoleum." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A family tomb." The old man nodded. "Aye, the Halberds were never buried in the local parish. Always right here, beneath this very soil. Rumor was, they brought something back from the east, something they weren't meant to. Seeds, tinctures, spells maybe." "And the altar?" I asked. "It covered the old crypt entrance. I sealed it myself, Miss Clarissa's request. Said no one should ever go down again." Holmes crouched before the base of the pedestal, brushing away soil with his gloved fingers. Soon, the rim of a rusted iron ring appeared. "She was right about one thing," Holmes said. "No one should have." With Ellis's help, we unearthed the stones around the altar base and pried them loose. Beneath lay a narrow stone shaft, descending steeply into blackness. A sickly sweet scent wafted upward, clove, and something disturbingly sweet, like overripe fruit left to ferment. Holmes lit a lantern. "I shall go first," he said, and disappeared down the steps. I followed, lantern in hand, and Helena brought up the rear, braver now in daylight, yet pale as chalk. The staircase led us to a stone chamber lined with coffins, some ornate, others little more than rough wooden boxes. Vines had breached the crypt, curling across the floor and wrapping themselves lovingly around the old caskets. In the center lay a circle etched into the stone, filled with dried petals and dark stains. At its center, a small urn sat on a plinth. Holmes knelt beside it. "The root," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. "A seed vessel, likely ancient, the kind once used in burial rituals in Southeast Asia. It would have held soil from a sacred mountain, perhaps ashes too. The roses, they didn't simply grow, they were bred, and the woman," Helena whispered, "born from it, or bound to it. Either way, she cannot exist without this." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a flask of clear liquid. "Nitric acid," he said simply. "No incantation." I asked. He raised an eyebrow. "Science often plays the role of exorcist." As he poured the acid onto the urn, it hissed violently. Smoke erupted in great curling plumes, and the vines recoiled from the stone with audible shrieks, slithering back like wounded snakes. From above, a terrible wail echoed down the shaft. Clarissa's voice, in agony and rage. Then silence, utter, oppressive silence. Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees. "There, the seed is dead." Helena exhaled, her hands trembling. "So she's gone. For now," Holmes said, "but roots run deep. And some flowers bloom again." Chapter 14. The Ashes Speak Twice. It was late afternoon when we emerged from the crypt, blinking into the sickly orange light. The greenhouse stood quiet, no whispering vines, no unseen stirrings in the corners. The oppressive presence that had haunted its every pane of glass had lifted, though not entirely vanished. Holmes closed the iron trap-door behind him and replaced the heavy stones. He gave no grand pronouncements, only a thin, grim line of satisfaction on his lips. "Rituals are curious things, Watson," he said, as we walked back toward the manor. "They can be broken, but not erased. The memory of them clings like smoke in old velvet." Inside, Helena had collapsed into one of the her-backed chairs in the study, a shawl drawn around her shoulders. She looked younger now, but also hollowed, like a shell left too long in the tide. "I thought it would end with her," she murmured. "Clarissa, but I feel as if something is still." Watching, Holmes poured her a small glass of brandy, pressing it gently into her hand. "What watches may simply be the mind seeking shapes in shadow. But you are not wrong to feel unfinished. There is still a question I have yet to answer." He walked over to the mantelpiece, where a single photograph had stood untouched throughout the chaos. A picture of Clarissa, younger, holding a crimson rose against her breast. Her expression was one of defiant serenity, though her eyes held something sharper, a knowing, a warning. Holmes removed the frame and opened the back. Inside, tucked behind the cardboard, was a sliver of paper. "Well hidden," he said. "Clarissa didn't want this found by just anyone." He read silently, his brows furrowing. Then he passed it to me. The ash must fall where the root once clung. The blood is the key. She cannot rest until it is returned. The curse is not mine, it was sown long before me. I merely watered it. A confession. I asked an instruction. Holmes replied. Clarissa believed herself a steward of something ancient, dangerous, but necessary. She feared it, yet obeyed it. And now she is dead. The ritual broken, but something remains unfinished. Helena's hands trembled. You think she's not truly gone? I think she made sure she could not be forgotten. Holmes said. There's one place we haven't yet examined. The music room, where this all began. The Manor's music room was a decaying cathedral of echoes. Dust hung in shafts of light from the tall windows, and the grand piano stood silent in the corner, its lid propped open like a yawning mouth. Holmes moved toward the far wall, where a crimson curtain hung across a recess. It had once framed a harpsichord, Helena told us, but now stood empty. With a swift motion, Holmes drew it back. Behind it was a fresco, faded but unmistakable, a garden, but not one of Edenic beauty. This was thorned, overgrown, riddled with writhing vines, and at its center, a robed figure knelt before a stone urn. Holmes stepped closer, his fingers tracing the etched outlines. This, he whispered, is older than the house, a reproduction of something, perhaps a vision, or an ancestral record. But why here? I asked. Because this room was the heart of her spell, not the greenhouse, not the crypt. This room fed the memory, the music, the curtain. He turned to Helena. Tell me, did your aunt ever play this piano? She shook her head. No, never. She said the music was not for us. Holmes pressed a few keys. A low, dissonant chord echoed out, and suddenly, the curtain twitched, not from the wind. Something behind it had shifted. Holmes reached behind the fresco and pulled. A soft click echoed. A hidden panel slid open. Inside was a second urn, smaller, blackened with soot. Coiled around it was a vine, still alive despite the lack of sunlight. Holmes looked to Helena. This is the ash, she meant. The last of it. The seed that must return to the soil. Helena stepped forward slowly. And if we don't? He met her gaze. Then the roots grow again. And next time, they will not whisper, they will consume. Without another word, she lifted the urn from the cavity, her hands steady now. Holmes nodded. Come, we end this at the place it began. Chapter 15. Return to the soil. Alpha. Twilight mist hung low as we stepped into the gardens once more. The urn swaddled in thick velvet and cradled gently in Helena's arms. The air had grown colder, the scent of moss and wilted leaves more pungent than before. The dying light bled through the tree branches, casting broken shadows across the path like fingers of a sleeping giant. Holmes led the way, his lantern casting a pale, flickering glow. I followed close behind, and Helena trailed us silently, as though under a spell. There was a finality to her movements, each step weighed by purpose. She said nothing, but her face bore the same iron resolve I had once seen in grieving women at gravesides, too proud to weep, too burdened to retreat. We reached the greenhouse for the second time that day, though now it looked more like a mausoleum than a place of growth. Its windows no longer shimmered with unnatural life, but stood cold and cracked. The vines within stilled as though in mourning. Holmes paused before entering, placing a gloved hand on the frame. You remember the location? He asked softly. Helena nodded. Under the rosebed, the oldest one. Inside, the glass panels moaned as wind passed across their edges. Holmes's boots crunched over dried soil and broken petals as he led us to the eastern quadrant. The rosebed there was withered, blackened stems, and thornless branches sagged toward the earth. No scent of roses lingered, only the stench of damp decay. Without a word, Holmes knelt and began to dig with his bare hands. The soil gave way easily, as if expecting them. Soon, the edge of a stone box emerged, weathered and moss. He cleared it gently, brushing away the clinging dirt. This is it, he said. Helena approached, and without prompting, lowered the urn into the hollow cavity. As it touched the stone, the air in the greenhouse seemed to shift. A low vibration hummed through the glass panes, subtle but undeniable, like a sigh released from beneath the roots of the world. Holmes stood. Now, the soil. Cover it, she did, scooping handfuls of earth back into the pit, her fingers stained black. I could see her hands trembling now, not from fear, but something more profound, a letting go. When the final layer was in place, Helena remained crouched over the site for a moment longer. Her eyes were shut, She whispered something beneath her breath, too soft for us to hear. Then, it was done. We turned to leave, but as we reached the door, a sudden crack echoed from behind us. The rosebush, lifeless only moments before, had moved. A single green shoot had emerged from the bed. We froze. It rose slowly, curling upward in a spiral. At its tip, a bud unfurled, and there, blooming in the dying light, was a single roseblood red, vibrant, full of impossible life. Helena gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Holmes, however, did not flinch. "A symbol," he murmured. "The cycle fulfilled. Not a curse, but memory returned to its rightful place." I approached the bloom cautiously. "Is it safe?" Holmes gave a rare smile, somber but certain. "So long as it is left undisturbed." We exited the greenhouse and sealed the door behind us. The mist thickened, cloaking the building once more in silence. Back inside the manor, Helena sat once more in the study, her shawl discarded now. The light from the hearth danced across her face, and for the first time since we had arrived, there was a warmth in her expression not born from fire. "What will become of this place?" she asked. "That is your decision," Holmes said, "but I suggest you let it sleep. Houses such as this, remember." She nodded. "I will leave it to the earth." Holmes stood. "Then our task is finished." But as we stepped into the night once more, I could not help but glance back at the greenhouse. Its windows reflected only the stars, but behind the glass, I thought I saw the rose glowing still. Chapter 16. The Gardener's Confession. We left Ravenwood Manor under a sky thick with cloud, but Holmes, rather than returning directly to London, requested one final stop in the nearby village. His mind, though seemingly satisfied with the events within the greenhouse, remained quietly alert, his gaze distant, his fingers tapping an invisible rhythm against his thigh as we drove. "Something troubles you," I ventured. "Something nags," he murmured. The rose bloomed. Yes, the urn was returned, but no ghost makes mischief without help. I blinked. "You believe someone assisted the phenomenon?" "I believe someone exploited it," he said simply, "and I believe I know who." We arrived at a modest stone cottage, nestled at the village's edge. The garden out front was neat, almost two perfect hedges trimmed into uniform domes, flower beds symmetrical to a fault. An old man in a wide-brimmed hat was pruning a hydrangea with a pair of silver shears. Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Crowthorne, I presume?" The man looked up, blinking behind spectacles. "That I am. I'm Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We've just come from Ravenwood." A flicker of recognition crossed Crowthorne's face, followed quickly by wariness. "I've not set foot there in over a year." Holmes smiled thinly. "And yet, your mark is everywhere." Crowthorne stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Holmes stepped closer, his voice soft but piercing. "You were the last gardener before the estate was shuttered. You knew of the urn, its placement in the rosebed, the strange vitality of the plants above it. You also knew Helena's mind was beginning to unravel from grief, a dangerous combination. I tended the soil, that's all," Crowthorne muttered. "The urn was placed long before I arrived." Holmes tilted his head. "But it was you who cultivated that particular patch, ensuring the rose thrived. You, who added certain agents to the soil, nitrates perhaps, or organic accelerants to enhance the uncanny growth. And when Helena began to notice the unnatural blooms, you let her believe they were haunted." Crowthorne's hand tightened on the shears. Holmes continued. "Perhaps you meant no harm. Perhaps you believed it to be kind, feeding her belief that her husband watched over the garden, taming her sorrow into something she could bear." The old man said nothing. "But grief," Holmes said darkly, "has a long tail. You should have stopped when she became obsessed, when she refused to leave the manor, when she heard voices." Crowthorne's voice cracked. "She wouldn't listen. She said the roses were speaking to her, that they bloomed in his voice. I tried to uproot them once. She wept for hours. After that, I left them be. I thought maybe she needed it." Holmes nodded. "And the curtain in the guest room?" "I don't know about that," Crowthorne said quickly. But Holmes's stare pinned him. "You used it as a prop, a subtle encouragement. Slashed it, perhaps, so she'd think the house itself was warning her." Now the old man sank onto the wooden step. The shears clattered to the stone beside him. "I didn't mean for it to go so far," he whispered. "But it brought her comfort, until it didn't. And by then, the house was too full of shadows. Even I couldn't even bear to stay." Watson and I exchanged glances, the final puzzle piece fitting into place. Holmes regarded the man for a long moment, then said, No crime was committed, no laws broken, but perhaps life is distorted. Crowthorne nodded mutely. Holmes turned without another word, and we walked back to the carriage. As we rode toward the station, I asked, "Why not tell Helena?" "Because her piece has only just begun," Holmes replied. "Let it rest. The garden will wither in time, and with it, the last breath of illusion." He folded his arms and closed his eyes. Behind us, the village grew small in the distance, and somewhere beyond the hills, the rose in the greenhouse swayed alone, its petals still catching the light of a vanished sun. Chapter 17. Shadows from the frame. The journey back to London passed in reflective silence. Holmes seemed to have retreated once more into his private realm of thought. His profile turned to the glass as the countryside slid past in blurred hues of green and gold. I let him be, content to process the case in my own mind, though, as ever, certain fragments refused to settle comfortably. Late in the afternoon, as we neared Baker Street, Holmes stirred. "You recall the portrait above the hearth in the Ravenwood drawing-room?" he asked suddenly. "Of Lord Alf?" "Certainly. Quite a formidable rendering." Holmes nodded. "Formidable, yes. And altered." I frowned. "Altered? It struck me as odd," he murmured. "The angle of the shoulders, the thickness of the frame. Something about it suggested tampering." "But what motive would there be to tamper with a portrait?" I asked. Holmes's eyes glittered. "That is precisely what I intend to determine." We alighted at Baker Street only long enough for Holmes to retrieve a small satchel of tools and a coiled length of twine. Without explanation, he hailed a cab and directed it not to our lodgings, but to the home of Inspector Lestrade. The inspector, surprised but ever obliging, welcomed us in. "I trust you have something more than idle curiosity this time, Holmes?" he asked, offering a cigar that Holmes declined with a distracted wave. "I require access to the Ravenwood Manor once more," Holmes said briskly. "Tonight, if possible. There is one final matter to resolve." Lestrade looked exasperated but intrigued. "That case again? I thought it done and dusted." "Only nearly," Holmes replied. "One thread remains fine, delicate, and possibly threaded through a gilded frame." Lestrade sighed and scratched his chin. "Very well, I'll send word to the local constable to expect us." That evening, as dusk cloaked the manor in deepening blue, we returned to Ravenwood. The estate was quiet, no sign of Helena or the caretakers. Holmes moved through the corridors with the silent certainty of a man retracing a mental map. We entered the drawing-room just as the light from the western window began to fade. He stood before the portrait of Lord Altham, studying it with narrowed eyes. The nobleman's gaze, forever cast downward, as if inspecting a lesser soul, glinted under the oil varnish. Holmes reached into his bag and withdrew a slim penknife. "Watson, the chair, if you please." I obliged, pulling it beneath the mantel. Holmes stepped up and, with careful precision, slid the blade between the frame and canvas along the lower right corner. There was a faint click. He withdrew the knife and inserted the tip of the twine into the seam. Gently, slowly, he tugged and a portion of the frame popped free like a hidden panel. Behind the canvas, folded in quarters and tucked flat against the wall, was a yellowing envelope. Lestrade let out a low whistle. Holmes carefully extracted it and stepped down, handling it as one might an ancient relic. The wax seal, though cracked, bore the unmistakable impression of the Altham family crest. With a glance for our approval, Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, ink faded but legible. "To whoever finds this, I have been a coward. I could not live with the shame of my brother's death, nor the truth of the rose garden. It was I who argued with him the night he vanished. I found the shattered glass near the greenhouse steps. I buried the urn, believing it would bring Helena peace. But the house has changed. It groans at night. The shadows flicker in ways that mock light, and I feel I am being watched from within the very walls I once called sanctuary. I do not know if I am mad, but if you are reading this, know that the ghost is mine, not hers, and it will not let me leave. FF, I whispered. Frederick Altham. Holmes nodded gravely. The brother, presumed to have died abroad, but this suggests otherwise. Then the ghost was his creation? Lestrade asked. More likely his guilt, Holmes replied softly. A haunting of the soul rather than the supernatural. The silence that followed was reverent. Holmes replaced the letter in its envelope and tucked it into his coat. "We will give it to Helena," he said. "She deserves to know the full truth, even if the truth is burdened with pain." We exited the manor once more. stepping into the crisp air of twilight. A single light flickered in the greenhouse behind us. This time, Holmes did not look back. Chapter 18. The final petaled the morning after our return from Ravenwood. A soft drizzle hung over London like a curtain of grey silk. Holmes, perched by the fireplace with his fingers tented beneath his chin, had not spoken for some time. The envelope containing Frederick Altham's confession lay open on the table beside him. The cracked wax seal now fully broken. Helena Altham arrived just after 10. She was composed, her dark gloves damp from the rain, her expression unreadable as Holmes offered her tea and motioned for her to sit. I noticed the faintest tremble in her fingers as she accepted the cup. "You've found something," she said. Holmes nodded slowly. "We found your uncle's writing, Miss Altham, hidden behind the portrait above the hearth. A letter, his final thoughts." She inhaled, the sound soft but jagged, like paper tearing. Holmes handed her the envelope. She read in silence, once, then again. When she looked up, her eyes shimmered, but she did not weep. "I always wondered," she murmured. "My father would never have left without a word. I thought, perhaps my uncle knew something. But this," she broke off. "Guilt is a long corridor," Holmes said gently. "Your uncle sealed his sorrow behind painted faces and garden hedges. In the end, the house bore the weight of it." Helena managed a weak smile. "And the rose garden?" Holmes nodded. "Your father's urn was buried there. Your uncle hoped it would give you peace, but perhaps it only gave the house a reason to whisper." She set the letter down and stood. "I'll have the grounds searched properly. I want father reburied with dignity." "There's one more thing," Holmes said, rising. "The curtain, the one from your childhood sketch." Helena's brow furrowed. "It was not merely a dream," he said. "The detail of the thorns, the darkness in the folds had mirrored the exact pattern woven into the old tapestry in the greenhouse, a relic from years past. I believe it lingered in your memory, twisted by grief and confusion. But it wasn't supernatural," she said slowly. "Processing." "No," Holmes said. "Only the human mind, casting shadows when it cannot bear light." She took a long breath, as though drawing in clarity for the first time in years. Lestrade arrived shortly after. Having confirmed that the greenhouse urn did, indeed, contain human remains, there would be an official inquiry. But Holmes had no doubt that Frederick Altham's final confession would suffice for the authorities. The rest, he said, was a matter for the family to reconcile, not the law. Helena departed in silence. The letter clutched to her chest like a relic. As she stepped into her carriage, the rain finally ceased, and a shaft of pale light broke through the clouds. I turned to Holmes. "You believe she'll be all right? She's stronger than she knows," he replied. "Most people are, once the truth is unburdened, and the house—" "Ah," Holmes said, reaching for his pipe. "Houses are curious things, Watson. They absorb what we press into them, grief, love, memory. But once the mind is freed, the walls cease their murmuring." He puffed once, the smoke curling upward like a ghost made of mist. I let the silence settle, and then, curiosity getting the better of me, I asked, "With the scratch marks, the voice in the corridor?" "Even I saw the figure in the garden that night." Holmes smiled faintly. "Your figure in the garden, Watson, was most likely a gardener fleeing from late work, startled by two intruders stomping through his shrubs. As for the voice, I suspect a clever echo in those long halls and old vents. And the scratch marks, perhaps the desperate clawing of a man wrestling with conscience. You always make it sound so prosaic, and you always wanted to be a ghost," Holmes said, eyes twinkling. I chuckled. "Still," I said, "it was a strange case." "One of the strangest," he agreed. Outside, a single petal from a rose perhaps caught on the hem of Helena's coat, drifted onto the steps of 2-1B, then blew gently down the pavement, carried away by the wind.